G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Footsteps of the Messiah. This is a study of the last days. This is from a book presented by Dr. Arnold Fuchtenbahn. Thank you for coming along. So we're back. We're now into session 22. The last time we met, we were looking at the four facets of the final restoration of Israel. We have the regeneration of Israel. We have the regathering of Israel into the land. We're going to have the possession of the land. We're going to have the reestablishment of the Davidic throne. Now, we've completed the regeneration of Israel, and we're currently in the regathering section of Israel. Now, the basis of the regathering is the land covenant, which is based on the land covenant of Deuteronomy 29 and 30. We also see that the prophetic development of this covenant, last session we started and we found in Isaiah 11 and 12 and chapter 27 and 43, and we also find it in the prophet Jeremiah. We're now going to continue on in Jeremiah's prophecies regarding the regathering of Israel. Now, Jeremiah 23, verses 3 to 4, where we finished last session, we saw that from all over the world, the Jews are to be regathered into the land, where they're going to produce much fruit, and God is going to provide them with virtuous leaders, lead them in righteousness and all the justice, all those things. Now, back in Jeremiah 16, verses 14 to 15, Jeremiah likened this regathering to the Exodus because of its magnitude. Now we have another comparison with the Exodus here in Jeremiah 23, verses 7 to 8. Therefore, behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that they shall no more say, as Jehovah lives, who brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, that's the Exodus, but as Jehovah lives, who brought up and who led the seed of the house of Israel out of the north country, and from all the countries whither I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land. Jeremiah 31, 7 to 10 is another passage that speaks of the regathering. So following on from the regeneration of Israel, where Jehovah saves his people, the remnant of Israel, that's verse 7, all the Jews are now going to be regathered, regardless of their state of health, because he says, the blind, the lame, the woman with child, and her that travails with child together, regardless of their location, are all going to be gathered back into the land. There will be absolutely no hindrances whatsoever to the regathering, for they will walk, it says, in a straight way wherein they shall not stumble. He that scattered Israel, which was God, will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. So the one who was able to scatter will also be able to regather, and that is God himself. The motif is again picked up with another major prophet, Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 11, verses 14 to 18. The same God who scattered Israel, here Ezekiel writes, thus says the Lord Jehovah, whereas I have removed them far off among the nations, and whereas I have scattered them among the countries, so this is in verses 14 to 16 of Ezekiel, he now has every intention of regathering them back into their own land. He says, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. That's verse 17. And so now we're going to see that the regenerate nation can cleanse the land of all the pollution. This is the spiritual pollution, not the weather. Later on, the prophet restated this similar doctrine in Ezekiel 36, verse 24, where he says, for I will take you from among the nations and gather you out of all the countries and will bring you into your own land. If nothing else, what we see here is repetition, telling us once again and again that God is going to regather them back into the land. Now, it wasn't just the major prophets who spoke about this, because a couple of the minor prophets also spoke about this. One of those is Amos, in Amos chapter 9, verses 14 to 15. Now, the emphasis of Amos is on permanency. The Jewish people are to be regathered, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. So what are they going to be doing? They're going to be rebuilding the land. And in the final regathering, God will plant them in Israel so that they shall no more be plucked up out of their land, which I have given them. They will never again be uprooted and dispersed from the land. Once God brings them all back into that land, in that final regathering, they'll never again be dispersed. The prophet Zephaniah, whose whole theme was one of judgment, he closes his book with a promise of the final regathering in chapter 3, verses 18 to 20. And what we see there is that the judgment that was meted out against Israel is the result of her sins. And these judgments, back in Zephaniah, will not be destructive. They'll actually be corrective. They're like discipline. Once correction has taken place, the regathering will occur, and the final regathering will cause Israel to be a name and a praise among the Gentile nations, which we see in verse 20. At that time will I bring you in, and at that time will I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all the peoples of the earth when I bring back your captivity before your eyes, says Jehovah. So Jehovah God's going to bring them back into the land, and they will now become a name and a praise amongst all the Gentile nations because of what God has done. The final prophet of the Old Testament to speak of the regathering is Zechariah. And we find this in Zechariah chapter 10, verses 8 to 12. Now, as Zechariah portrayed the final regathering, he saw it in terms of hissing. Remember, Zechariah was the one who writes about the good shepherd. So he saw it in terms of hissing, which is the call of a shepherd for his sheep. And Zechariah says in verse 8, I will hiss for them and gather them. So the regathering will be a result of the redemption and the regeneration of Israel. For I have redeemed them, and they shall live with their children and shall return. Now, while the regathering is to occur from around the world, there's going to be a special emphasis upon the Middle Eastern nations in verses 10 to 11 of Zechariah 10. The pride of Assyria shall be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart. So once all the Jews are regathered, they will never again depart from the Lord, for they shall walk up and down in Jehovah's name, never to be shifted again from that land. Now, that's the Old Testament. That's the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, what do we read there? It says, Matthew 24, 31, it says, he shall send forth his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, where is this from? Well, the background to this verse is Isaiah 27, verses 12 to 13, where it says, Jesus declared that the angels will be involved in the final regathering, as they're going to bring the Jews back into the land from the entire world, from all over the world. Now, the Matthew passage is a simple summary of all that the prophets had to say about the second facets of Israel's restoration. Now, what was its purpose? Well, its purpose was to make clear to everyone that the worldwide regathering predicted by the prophets will be fulfilled only after the second coming. So the worldwide regathering predicted by these prophets back into the land where there'll be permanency will be fulfilled only after the second coming. Now, the parallel verse to Matthew 24 is Mark chapter 13, verse 27, which adds a little bit more detail. And then shall he send forth the angels, and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, so far so good, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. So what we see here is that with the background of Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 to 4, Jesus now added that the regathering will be from the uttermost part of the earth, that will be living Israel at that time, and the uttermost part of heaven. That's going to be resurrected Israel. They're going to be brought back into the land permanently. Now we're coming into the possession of the land. So we've done the regeneration, the restoration. Now we have the possession of the land. Now, what is the basis for the possession of the land? Well, the basis for this is the Abrahamic Covenant. And this Abrahamic Covenant, it has two aspects to it. It has its total boundaries, the length and breadth of the land, and also its productivity. Now, we're going to look at these verses that deal with the land aspect. Now, when did the Abrahamic Covenant begin? Well, it began in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. When the covenant was initially made, Abraham was simply told, get you out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house onto the land that I will show you. Now, Abraham was only promised by God to be shown a land, and that was it, nothing else. So when he arrived in the land, God again revealed himself to Abraham and said, unto your seed will I give this land. We see that in chapter 12, verse 7. So the promise here is made that Abraham's seed will be given the land. But what about Abraham? Will he possess the land? Well, we go on to Genesis 13. So it's a progression here. We go on to Genesis 13, verses 14 to 17, and it now makes it clear. Verse 15 says, for all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. So the promise, this Abrahamic covenant, the promise was clearly made that he personally would possess the land as well as his seed. But you know what? Abraham died having only possessed a few wells and a burial cave which he had to buy. For God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, two things have to occur. Abraham must be resurrected, and the land must be restored to Israel. Two things. Abraham must be resurrected, and the land must be restored to Israel. Now, since Abraham's seed is to possess the land as well, the population of Israel will greatly increase at that time. And he goes on to say here in verse 16 of chapter 13, and they will be as the dust of the earth. So Abraham was then directed to walk throughout the land in order to get to know it very well, for someday he will possess it. That's verse 17 of Genesis 13. Now, in Genesis 13, Abraham was told that all the land he could possibly see would one day belong to him. But no boundaries were actually given. Later on, as God signed the covenant, he specifically mentioned the border of the land, and we find this in Genesis 15, verses 12 to 21. At the time of the signing and the sealing of the Abrahamic Covenant, God spelled out the future history of Abraham's descendants prior to their initial possession of the land. And we find this in verses 12 to 16. They would be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So that was a time when they were down in Egypt. Then God signed and sealed the covenant in verse 17. It says, a smoking furnace and a flaming torch passed between these pieces of animals. God then declared what the boundaries of the land will be in verses 18 to 21. The borders are to extend from the Euphrates River in the north to the river of Egypt in the south. Okay. He says in verse 18, unto your seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So, borders of the promised land, Israel, are to extend from the Euphrates River in the north to the river of Egypt in the south. Well, Euphrates River is easy enough to identify, but what is the river of Egypt? Now, some have identified the river of Egypt as the brook of Egypt mentioned in other passages, and both have at times been identified with the Nile River, making the Nile River the southern border of the promised land. But neither of these can be correct. The brook and the river of Egypt are not the same. The river refers to the Hebrew word refers to a continuous flowing stream, while the brook is a wadi, and it's a dry riverbed that only holds water periodically during the rainy season. So they're two different things. The brook of Egypt is the modern day Wadi El Arish. Wadi El Arish. And that runs south to north in the central Sinai Peninsula. The river of Egypt is also not the Nile, because if the river of Egypt was the Nile, well, the Jews would have been already in the promised land before they ever left Egypt. So it can't be the river Nile. The river of Egypt refers to one of the distributaries of the Nile. As the Nile River flows from the south to the north before reaching the Mediterranean Sea, it enters an area known as the Nile Delta, where it then breaks up into several branches. Now, the most easterly distributary was known as the River of Egypt. And today, this river follows the line of the modern-day Suez Canal. So this is going to be Israel's southern border, the area bounded by the Suez Canal. Northern border will be the river Euphrates. Now, that was dealing with Abraham, and now we have his son Isaac. We have a reconfirmation here with Isaac in Genesis 26, verses 2 to 5, the seed of Abraham. Jehovah appeared unto him, this is verse 2, Jehovah appeared unto him and said, go not down into Egypt. So Isaac is commanded to stay in the land and not to leave it. For unto you and unto your seed I will give all these lands. So it is to Isaac and to his seed that the land will be given in verse 3. Notice that the promise here is not just to Isaac's descendants, but to Isaac himself. And this is also going to require his future resurrection and possession of the land. As for Isaac's seed, it will be greatly increased in population. He says, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven in verse 4. So it is to Isaac, not Ishmael, nor the 6 sons of Keturah, that the Abrahamic covenant is reconfirmed. It's verse 5. Yeah, Keturah was the wife that he took on after Sarah had died. The Abrahamic covenant is now reconfirmed to Jacob and not to his brother Esau, according to Genesis 28, verses 13 to 15. Here it says, the land, regarding to Jacob, the land whereon you lie, to you will I give it. It's verse 13. And to your seed. So the promise now is that the land will be given to both Jacob and to Jacob's seed in verse 13. Again, we see here that the promise is made to the individual, Jacob, as well as the seed. Again, this means that Jacob must also be resurrected to possess the land sometime in the future. As it was said previously, your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. So the seed is going to be greatly multiplied at that time. Now, as for Jacob himself, who was now departing from the land, God will bring him back again into the land in his own lifetime. So then, the third facet of Israel's final restoration is based on the Abrahamic Covenant, which is reconfirmed through Isaac and Jacob, and then to all of Jacob's descendants. Now remember, a Jew is anyone who's a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that was the development that we found in the non-prophetic books. Now, in the prophetic development, what we see here is that the possession of the land is now further developed in both the law and the prophets. As far as the law is concerned, we find it in Leviticus 26, verses 40 to 45. Following on from the regeneration of Israel in verses 40 and 41 of Leviticus 26, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their father in their trespass which they trespassed against me, and also that because they walked contrary unto me. And 41, if then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity. So what we see here is that God will now fully carry out the promises of the Abrahamic covenant concerning the land with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. And we see this in verse 42. Now, based on this covenant, Jehovah their God says, I will not reject them, neither will I abhor them, to destroy them utterly and to break my covenant with them. He's not going to do that. He will restore to the Jewish people the land that has lain desolate for so long. And that's in 43 to 45 of Leviticus 26. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 5, the possession of the land is also part of the land covenant. And Jehovah your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. Now, the prophets of Israel developed this possession of the land even further in both the major and minor prophets. In the first group, we see in Isaiah 27:12, the major prophet, Isaiah 27:12 states this. And it shall come to pass in that day that Jehovah will beat off his fruit from the flood of the river onto the brook of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O you children of Israel. The verse here elaborates on the first aspect, which was the borders of the land, or which is the borders of the land. The northern, the Euphrates River, and southern, the brook of Egypt boundaries are possessed for the first time in all of Israel's history. Israel will be able to settle in all of the promised land for the very first time. Isaiah goes on in Isaiah 30, verses 23 to 26, and here he stresses the increased productivity of the land. 23 to 25 says, you're going to have the rain for your seed, the ground is going to increase, your cattle will feed in large pastures, and upon every lofty mountain, upon every high hill, there's going to be brooks and streams of waters. So what we see here is that the land will be well watered and will produce abundant food, both for men and animals. Productivity. Now in verse 26, we also see a tremendous increase of light. Moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days. So the moon is going to shine as brightly as the sun, while the light of the sun will be increased 7 times what it is today. It just says the light. It doesn't say the heat. It just says the light. It will also be a time of total healing. In the day that Jehovah binds up the hurt of his people and heals the stroke of their wound. So this healing is of all physical infirmities. As for the deserts of Israel, Isaiah 35, 1 to 2 says something about that, because he says in Isaiah 35, the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of Jehovah, the excellency of our God. So the deserts are blooming away. The productivity aspect is again brought out by Isaiah in Isaiah 65, 21 to 24. Isaiah says, they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree shall be the days of my people, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. So what we see here is that with the possession of the land of Israel, not only will the Jews be able to build houses and plant vineyards and crops, but they'll also enjoy the work of their hands. For why? Because no enemy will take it from them. They will enjoy it until a ripe old age. Back to the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 31, verses 1 to 6, he also stresses great productivity of the land in the final restoration. God's everlasting love for his people is seen in verses 1 to 3 of Jeremiah 31. At that time, says Jehovah, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Jehovah appeared of old unto me, saying, yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn you. So God intends to restore and build them again. In verse 4, we see that again will I build you, and you shall be built. So once again, there's going to be a time of plenty in Israel. Verse 5. Again, you shall plant vineyards upon the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant and shall enjoy the fruit thereof. Again, security. And in verse 6, the hills of Ephraim will echo with the call to come and worship God in Jerusalem. The watchmen upon the hills of Ephraim shall cry, arise ye, and let us go up to Zion unto Jehovah our God. Jeremiah later returned to the theme in verses 11 to 14 of chapter 31. In verse 11, we now see the redemption of Israel. For Jehovah has ransomed Jacob and redeemed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. The Jews will then be restored to the land which will produce an abundance. And they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, and shall flow unto the goodness of Jehovah to the grain, and to the new wine, and to the oil, and to the young of the flock and of the herd. And their soul shall be as a watered garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. This will give joy to all the inhabitants in verses 13 to 14. Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them and make them rejoice from their sorrow. Jeremiah then goes on to write, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, says Jehovah. Now, Ezekiel, he's not left out. He also picked up the motif of the possession of the land. And we find this in Ezekiel 20, verses 42 to 44. So what we see here is that the Jewish people are to be brought back into their land in accordance with the promises of God to the forefathers in the Abrahamic Covenant. Here he says, verse 42, and you shall know that I am Jehovah, when I shall bring you into the land of Israel, into the country which I swore to give unto your fathers. That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the Abrahamic Covenant. Now, Israel will turn away from her sins of the past and will then detest them. We see this in 43. And there shall ye remember your ways and all your doings wherein you have polluted yourselves, and you shall loathe yourselves in your own sight for all your evils that you have committed. Now she will serve God alone. In verse 44, and you shall know that I am Jehovah, when I have dealt with you for my name's sake. Further on in Ezekiel 28, 25 to 26, following Israel's regeneration and her regathering, Israel will possess the land in accordance with the Abrahamic Covenant in verse 25. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, when I shall have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and shall be sanctified in them in the sight of the nations, then shall they dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. The security in which Israel will live and enjoy the works of her hands is then emphasized in verse 26. And they shall dwell securely therein. Yes, they shall build houses, plant vineyards, and they shall dwell securely, when I have executed judgments upon all those that do them despite round about them. And they shall know that I am Jehovah their God. Now, the security aspect, along with the element of increased productivity, is also the theme of Ezekiel 34, 25 to 31. And I'll make them with a covenant of peace, and will cause evil beasts to cease out of the land. And they shall dwell securely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods. So, since there will no longer be any wild beasts in the land, the Jewish people will be able to enjoy Israel in total security. The rains will come in their proper time and in proper amounts, according to verse 26. And I'll make them and the places round about my hill a blessing, and I will cause the shower to come down in its season. There shall be showers of blessing. And this is going to bring about increased productivity in verse 27. And the trees of the field shall yield its fruit, and the earth shall yield its increase. Now, not only is Israel going to be secure from wild beasts, but also from all her enemies of the past. This is 27 to 28. And they shall be secure in their land. They shall no more be a prey to the nations, neither shall the beasts of the earth devour them, but they shall dwell securely, and none shall make them afraid. None will come to destroy the crops. They shall no more consumed with famine in the land, neither bear the shame of the nations anymore. That's when they used to be robbed by the nations. In every way, Israel is going to be rightly related to God and will be his special possession. We see this in 30 to 31. And they shall know that I, Jehovah, their God, am with them, and that they, the house of Israel, are my people, says the Lord Jehovah. In Ezekiel 36, 8 to 15, the prophet continued his description of the situation at that time. Now, despite the years of desolation, the land is to be tilled again. Verse 8, but you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are at hand to come. For behold, I am for you, and I'll turn unto you, and you shall be tilled and sown. The land will be populated, for the number of inhabitants will be greatly increased, according to verses 10 and 11. I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, and the waste places shall be built, and I'll multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and be fruitful. And I will cause you to be inhabited after your former estate. Israel will again possess the land. Verse 12, yes, I will cause men to walk upon you, even my people Israel, and they shall possess you, and you shall be their inheritance, and you shall no more henceforth bereave them of children. The land will be tremendously productive, we see in verses 13 to 15. Later on in 38 now, I think I missed this out on your notes, but you can pick these notes up. I'll send them to you later on tonight. The prophet goes on here. Ezekiel declared that Israel will again possess the land, and you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I'll be your God. Now, this is a result of a regeneration. In verse 29, it says, and I will save you from all your uncleanness, and I will call for the grain and will multiply it and lay no famine upon you. So her reproach is going to be removed in verse 30. There's going to be an increase in production, and they would receive no more the reproach of famine among the nations. She's going to remember her evil ways, that they were not good. And you shall loathe yourselves in your own sight for your iniquities and for your abominations. So she will detest her past sins. Verse 32, not for your sake do I do this, says the Lord Jehovah, be it known unto you. So what we see here, it is not for Israel's glory that this regeneration and the tilling and rebuilding of the land takes place, but it is for God's own glory among the nations, as we see in verse 36. Then the nations that are left round about you shall know that I, Jehovah, have built the ruined places and planted that which was desolate. I, Jehovah, have spoken it, and I will do it. As for Israel, the population will increase, and the desolate places will be rebuilt, according to verses 37 to 38. I will increase them with men like a flock, as the flock for sacrifice, as the flock of Jerusalem in her appointed feast. So shall the waste cities be filled with flocks of men, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. Repossession of the land is also promised in the minor prophets, such as Joel in Joel 2, 18 to 27. God was jealous for his land and had pity on his people, verse 18. And this burning jealousy will bring about great productivity in the land, verse 19. I'll remove far off from you the northern army. So what we're going to see here is that the land will be secure from any further invasions, verse 20, and it's going to produce abundantly in verses 21 to 22. Why? Because he gives you the former rain in just measure, and he causes to come down for you the rain, the former rain, and the latter rain in the first month. So the rains are going to come at the proper seasons and in proper amounts. And this is going to cause tremendous amount of surplus in storage. Floors shall be full of wheat, and the vats shall overflow with new wine and oil. And then restoration from all previous losses due to pestilence. I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten, the cankerworm and the caterpillar and the palmer worm. Israel will never again be shamed, verse 26, but she will have a special relationship to God. And you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am Jehovah your God, and there is none else, and my people shall never be put to shame. Now, later on in Joel 3:18, the prophet also declared here that there's going to be an abundance of water in the land. It shall come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drop down sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk. And all the brooks of Judah shall flow with waters, and a fountain shall come forth from the house of Jehovah, and shall water the valley of Shittim. The increased productivity of the land is again pointed out by Amos in Amos 9:13. Behold, the days come, says Jehovah, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that sows seed. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. To summarize this, for the first time in Israel's history, she will possess all of the promised land, while the land itself will greatly increase in its productivity and be well watered, all on the basis of the Abrahamic Covenant. Now, we come into the reestablishment of the Davidic Covenant, or the Davidic Throne, which is the fourth facet of the final restoration of Israel. Now, the Davidic Covenant is based upon, the reestablishment of the Davidic Throne is based upon the Davidic Covenant, which we find in two passages of Scripture. The first one is in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11, second part of 11 to verse 16. Moreover, Jehovah tells you that Jehovah will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you shall sleep with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you that shall proceed out of your bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. So this is talking to David. In this kingdom, in this covenant here, David is promised that he will be the head of a dynasty. And after his passing, the throne will go to one of his sons, and that was Solomon, and the kingdom will be established in his hand. That's verse 12. Now, verse 13 says that he shall build a house for my name, and I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I'll be his father, he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. Verse 15. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. Now, what we see here is that it will be Solomon who will build the temple. And so God will establish his throne, God's throne, his throne, not Solomon himself, for eternity. So it's the throne is going to be established, not Solomon, for eternity. Solomon will sin, and God will have to punish him. But God's loyal love will not be removed from Solomon as it was removed from Saul. We see it in verses 14 to 15. Nevertheless, the Davidic house or dynasty, the Davidic throne and the Davidic kingdom will be eternal. Verse 16 tells us, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, the emphasis in this first account of the Davidic covenant has been on Solomon, right? This is talking about Solomon. Now, in the second passage, we have 1 Chronicles 17, second part of verse 10 down to 14. We have a slightly different emphasis here. The emphasis in this passage is not on Solomon, but on the Messiah. Verse 10. Moreover, I tell you that Jehovah will build you a house, and it shall come to pass when your days are fulfilled that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up your seed after you, who shall be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. So David here again is promised a dynasty, and sometime after his death, a descendant of one of his sons, one of your sons, it says, shall be established or will be established in the kingdom. Verse 12 says, he shall build me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. Now, the Samuel passage spoke of one of David's own sons, Solomon. But Chronicles, this first Chronicles 17, speaks of a descendant of another of David's sons, namely Jesus, who was a descendant of Nathan, one of David's sons, Nathan. This descendant of David, the Messiah, will also build God a temple. That's going to be the millennial temple. And his throne, according to verse 12, will be established forever. Verse 13 says, I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him that was before you. So God's mercy will never be removed from this one. Since the Samuel passage emphasized Solomon, there was the possibility of sin. But the Chronicles passage emphasizes the Messiah. Hence, there is no possibility and consequently no mention of sin in these verses. Verse 14 says, but I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. Finally, what we see here is that it is this person himself who is established forever, and not merely the dynasty, the kingdom, and the throne, but the person himself. The Davidic covenant promised 4 eternal things: an eternal dynasty, an eternal kingdom, an eternal throne, and an eternal person. The eternality of the dynasty, kingdom, and throne is guaranteed only because the seed of David culminated in the person who is himself eternal. That's the Messiah. That's Jesus. Jesus, or Messiah, holds three offices here: prophet, priest, and king. However, he does not function in all these offices simultaneously, but chronologically. During his ministry on earth at his first coming, Jesus functioned in the office of a prophet. At the time of his death, this office ended. Since his death and resurrection, and until he returns, he's currently functioning in the office of a priest. But this will cease at the second coming. Jesus has never yet functioned in the office of a king. For him to do so, there must be the reestablishment of the Davidic throne upon which he will sit to rule as king over Israel and king of the world. And this office will begin at the second coming. Now, what do the prophets have to say about this Davidic throne? The prophets do not cover this as extensively as how they covered the other facets of the restoration. But Jeremiah and Isaiah, they do. Jeremiah 23, 5-6 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely." Verse 6 goes on to say, "And this is the name by which he will be called. The Lord Jehovah is our righteousness." So what we see here is that he is a descendant of David, but his name is Jehovah our righteousness, and he sits on David's throne. So he is the God-man. In Isaiah 9, 6-7, again, we see a descendant of David, a man, a Jewish man. His name, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Names only ascribed to God. Again, his divinity. So what we see in these two passages is that the God-man will sit on the throne of David. Several other passages. We have Psalm 89. Psalm 89, verses 3-4 says this: "I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn unto David my servant. Your seed will I establish forever, and build up your throne to all generations." Now, what we see here is that it is God who has made an eternal covenant with David. And the covenant includes the establishment of an eternal dynasty and an eternal throne. Now, the eternality of the dynasty and the throne is restated later on in verse 29 of Psalm 89. "His seed also will I make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven." Still later on in verses 34-37, God declares, "My covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that is gone out of my lips." So, the continuation of the covenant is not dependent upon David or upon his descendants, but it's dependent upon God's character. Verse 35 says, once have I sworn by my holiness, I will not lie unto David." Since God does not lie, the covenant is sure to stand. And for that very reason, the eternality of the dynasty and the throne is assured. Verse 36 says, "His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever as the moon and as the faithful witness in the sky." The prophet Jeremiah also emphasizes the eternality of the Davidic covenant in Jeremiah 33, verses 17-26. It is impossible to break this covenant. Under no circumstances will the house of David ever become extinct. Verse 17 says, "For thus says Jehovah, David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel." Why? For the Davidic covenant is both unconditional and eternal. Verse 20 says, "Thus says Jehovah, if you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, so that there shall not be day and night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he shall not have a son to reign upon his throne, and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers." That was a promise made to Levi in the days of Aaron, back in Numbers 25. Now, about the eternality of the priest. Not only will there not be a cessation of the throne, of the Davidic throne, but there will also be a multiplication of the house of David. As the host of heaven cannot be, verse 22, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant and the Levites that minister unto me. So the reestablishment of his throne will be the antidote. The reestablishment of the Davidic throne will be the antidote to the poisonous teaching, the poisonous doctrines, especially among Gentiles, that God is finished with the house of David and with the house of Levi. This is what he says here in verse 23. God is not through with Israel. And the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah, saying, "Consider you not what this people have spoken, saying, the two families which Jehovah did choose, he has cast them off. Thus do they despise my people, that they should be no more a nation before them." They were saying here that the promises God has made to David and Levi have been rendered null and void, and that God no longer intends to fulfill his covenants with Israel. As we find in verses 23 to 26, God will fulfill every promise of the Davidic covenant, and we find it in 25 to 26. "Thus says Jehovah, if my covenant of day and night stand not, if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I also cast away the seed of Jacob and of David my servant, so that I will not take of his seed to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God will also fulfill the Abrahamic covenant, for I will cause their captivity to return and will have mercy on them." These verses here tell us straight out that God has not cast off Israel. One other passage we find is Amos chapter 9, verses 9 to 11. Chapter 9, 11 to 12. "In that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up its ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old." What this is saying is that when the kingdom is established, the ruins of the house of David will be repaired, and the Davidic throne will again exhibit all the glory of the days gone by. But in addition to the glory of the past, the authority of the re-established Davidic throne will extend to all the Gentile nations. Verse 12 says that they may possess the remnant of, this is Israel, under the Davidic throne, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that are called by my name, says Jehovah that does this. Now in the New Testament, in Luke, we see the re-establishment of the Davidic throne. This is found in Luke chapter 1, verses 32 to 33. "He shall be great and shall be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom, there shall be no end." All four key aspects of the Davidic covenant are mentioned in this Luke passage. The Son of the Most High is to sit upon the eternal throne over the eternal kingdom, for he was born into the eternal dynasty. The eternality of the dynasty, throne, and kingdom is assured because they all culminate in the person who is himself eternal, the Son of God. It says the Son of the Most High. The promises that God made to Israel have not been rendered null and void. Israel is yet to enjoy all the promises of the four unfulfilled covenants, unfulfilled unconditional covenants, each of which points respectively to the four facets of Israel's final restoration. And that ends us for this session. Pray that you'd have got something out of that. Study hard, grow strong.